Question for actually, should the current chair, we have a chair from the last term, should that continue? Or should I, as the board chair, take over till we elect a chair?
I think that would.
Okay. Well,
I think that's what we've done in the past.
okay. Okay, so are there any modifications? We'll call it to order at 12:10 or 12:11. Modifications to the agenda. Not seeing any declarations of pecuniary interest. Seeing none. Minutes of the previous meeting. Is there a mover and seconder for the minutes? Paul, Sandy, discussion on those? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed, that's carried. And now we'll move to the election of the finance chair. And hold a minute. Is there a mover and a seconder for finance and audit committee chair? Paul,
I would like to nominate Sandy to be the chair.
there's a seconder for that.
I'll second.
Dean, is there any discussion on that matter? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed, that's carried, and I will turn it over to Sandy.
Thank you, Brian. Can I get a motion to move into closed session? Moved by Brian, seconded by Dean. Discussion, all in favor? Carried?
Oh, or should you ever hand up for discussion?
Just voting.
No, I was just in favor.
We are now in camera. Okay. Do you want the motions now or? Michelle, you want the motions from in camera to be moved now? Yeah. So you're gonna read the one. Yeah.
Yes, I figured out what the problem was, and last year we added some other stuff to it, so I put something together. That the Finance and Audit Committee receives the draft audited statements, recommends approval of the draft audit statements by the board, and recommends the reappointment of the auditor.
So moved. Moved by Brian. Seconded by Dean. Thank you. Discussion on the motion? All in favor? Carried. And the second report, do you have wording as well? Oh, you're right, it's there.
So I'll move the recommendation that was presented in the report.
Is there a seconder? Moved by Paul, or seconded by Paul, rather. Discussion on the motion? All in favor? Carried. Thank you, Michelle. Item 6 is budgetary reserve policy discussion paper. Christie?
So with the Conservation Authority Act program category requirement, it does only make sense to restructure our reserves. And given the challenges in creating budgets and therefore the results of budgets and their impact on reserve, it's timely that we talk about how we budget and how we view our reserves and how they can be used and whether they're funded. So there's a lot of discussion that should happen, but we really should lay down some guidelines about how to budget going forward and where we expect reserves should be and whether we want to use reserves and how we're going to fund them. So, so this was written as a background document to help maybe highlight some of the issues that should be considered before we put a policy together, a straightforward policy. So there is a lot of commentary in here. bottom line is, should we be budgeting with a balanced budget in mind? Should we allow ourselves to have deficit budgets? And when we do, what will that do to our reserves?
Hmm.
And this is not immediate, this is to go through the next 20 years. Because we're at a changing point right now. The way I see it.
Well, I think this is an important discussion to have because we're not there. I guess the whole goal is, at the end of the day, is how do we get to an asset management program and budget for knowing what our costs are gonna be and making sure those reserve funds are there when we need them. But at the same time, we have an operational budget deficit every year where we're not, we're certainly not addressing that, and we have a, you know, we're probably not asking for enough, so we need to get the information. To form a full, we need to have that information about how much do we need and when for it. I think the asset management plan and stuff will come out of that. To me, there's some different styles that are used for preparing for like capital projects and reserve funding. About that, like I'll give an example, and in Ingersoll, we transfer, we do a large transfer reserve, and all capital projects come out of reserves, whether the money's through levy or future transfers or not. So you just make transfers reserve, and then all capital projects come from reserve funding.
Yeah.
Some places do it differently. They do a capital budgets, and they do like there's different ways to do that. So it's an important discussion about how we want. To me, I think we got to get to a point where we're getting adequate funding from our levy to be able to support our needs going forward, because we kind of do it in the past. We've been stealing from reserves to lower levy. And now our reserves funds, well, we don't really know yet, but assume that we're not at place. So I'll have a discussion there, and I'll leave it for others to input.
All in favor?
Mark's left.
Oh, Rick's left, okay. You're still quorum.
Yeah, and we're moving more in the direction of what Brian just mentioned in Zora, is that we're becoming much more aggressive with funding our reserves and funding capital projects out of reserves exclusively. And I think one of the things in your report here was talking about smoothing things out. And that's how you do that through reserves. The money's there rather than saying, oh crap, this year we got to spend $3 million on that. Where are we going to come up with it from? So yeah, everything that I saw in here made sense to me, because as I said, that's what we've been talking about at the historic level for a couple of years. And then we have the other incentive with moving to the category 1, 2, and 3, and all those things that makes total sense to revamp how we do things, budgeting, and we've already had to do it for the budget we just passed a couple months ago. Now the next step, as you see, for the next 20 years.
I think it's also a way to, you know, our municipalities are concerned about levy spikes, as most are. We want to try to, like I said, smooth things out as much as possible. I know experience with Ingersoll, that's what we've done, because once you build up the I'll say the tax rate is to a point where you have an average contribution, and this is where the asset management plan really comes in, and forecasting comes in. We have capital forecasting, but really once we need to know the operational asset of the organization from a capital perspective, not just for structures and stuff like that, but from a general capital need, because you need to be able to build up that levy as to a point where it's now self-funding and you've got capacity in it, and it takes a couple times to do that. So you can transfer enough without, in our case, we want to avoid going into debt for infrastructure. But in this case, we want to avoid fluctuating levels of levy, but still providing enough to avoid those issues where we've depleting reserves, or monies should be going to reserves for the points of levy control. So I guess my concern is right now is, and I know we're not there of getting there, we have to have further discussions, but. And I hear staffs, how far away, what are the next major steps? Do you see, but
What do we do first?
what do we do first?
Yeah.
Because I don't wanna, okay, we put these, you can't just put, okay, we're gonna put these policies in
Yeah.
place, but we don't know the information to form those
But,
policies.
you know, Christina's kind of thrown that at us
Yeah.
Yeah,
in this report.
Mhm.
And that's kind of where I wanted to go was, you know, so what do we have a sense of the implications? So, for example, if I'm reading the appendix correctly, you know, last page, we've got $6 million total reserve as of January 2020, right?
Yep.
You've done the work to divide them into the various categories,
Mhm.
most of which is campground.
Mhm.
So then I go back to reserve funding status and recommended balances that are in the report. And I was having, first off, I was having trouble adding the numbers up that you were suggesting.
Mhm.
What's the gap between the 6 million and what would be the number if these discussion pieces became policy?
That 6 million reserve, in my view, should be closer to 15 million.
15?
At this point, without an asset management plan in place.
Yeah,
But the asset management plan is only going to inform you on the capital spending.
Yeah.
And I'm suggesting that our operating reserve itself should be close to 3 million for
Right.
category 1 activities, which is at 315,000.
15,000.
Okay, so it's a tenfold increase roughly. The category 1. We're not gonna get from 315 to close to 3 million for category 1 programs with a $1 million projected deficit this year.
really?
The math doesn't work.
No, that math doesn't work.
Math ain't mathing.
That math doesn't work.
Arithmetic doesn't work.
Sure.
So I think it might help us at this point to focus on our operating budget. Because anything else is capital, anything else will come through an asset management plan. Anything else is generally funded, like Ingersoll funded through reserves. That is exactly what we're gonna be doing with the campground capital spending. They're gonna be absorbing a lot of their reserves this year and going forward. So it's kind of a separate umbrella. But I think it's very important that we talk about our operating reserve, our category 1 operating reserve,
Okay, well, let's focus on that for a minute.
and our budget approach.
There's-
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, so to me, there's a two-step process in here. We're once, the first step is that we're gonna have to make up that deficit that we're now putting in the reserves file on levy. Because we can't ask for more money to fund our reserves until we make up that deficit to get to zero. No, follow, no?
You're talking about an operating budget as balanced budget along with the reserves at the same time?
No, it's about transferring more money to the levy as opposed to taking, showing, and maybe this is the concern coming out of London for next year, because staff have had to put that in there of a budget increase to put that in there. So maybe that can be explained, but a little bit better than I'm doing for sure. But then we're gonna have to add on to get $3 million, we're gonna have to get that money from somewhere. And to me, that should be coming from levy. Because I don't know where else it would come from. There's no grants and stuff for that sort of thing, and no user fees could be used, so you don't have to necessarily, you may not see a decrease in levy requirements, but now you can use those those revenues for reserve, building operational reserve versus funding an apartment. You're still trading off, but at least you can, we gotta find more, we gotta find 2.7 million from somewhere.
Well, and that's what before we jump to that,
Yeah,
the 3 million, is that fully funded or is that
no,
different? Because your discussion paper on page 8 or 10, it's got 2 pages. 2 pages.
oh, does it?
Yeah,
Oh, for the-
the big 8 and the small 10. Okay. These are for discussion. I mean, you're throwing this out to us. And you're saying that, and let's focus on category 1, keep it narrow for now. To get to a $3 million operating reserve category 1, is that 100% fully funded? Or is that kind of a target below? And because where I'm going is you're suggesting that it need not be fully funded.
Correct.
So you're looking at us to come up with, well, what's a reasonable number? And is the $3 million the reasonable number? So that's not even fully funded, in other words.
No, the reserve should be, your reserve is a contingency. If
Yeah.
your operations go to hell in a handbasket one year, you've got a fire in your campgrounds or whatever happens, the organization still needs to operate.
Yeah.
It would run a deficit. It could run a $3 million deficit in a year in category 1.
If there's
If-
3 million
if-
in reserves.
If there's a $3 million reserve, yeah, you would be dipping into that. In that instance, you would want to have $3 million in the bank
Of course,
in that instance.
yeah.
But having that kind of contingency is expensive, not terribly likely, but could happen. You probably don't need that much cash. You might want to have half of that value in cash.
Right.
Right? So how much cash you have to substantiate your reserves is a very different question from what your reserves should be. If you have a $3 million deficit in 2024, your reserves cannot bear that today. That number does need to grow. What it needs to grow to is up for discussion. But the funding of a reserve need not be always 100%.
Yeah. So again, 300,000 is too low.
Definitely.
3 million may not be necessary. Right? So somewhere in the middle, or somewhere in between the two numbers, but it still has to come from the operating budget
Yes.
each and every year to get to a level. Because I don't think our member municipalities would be happy, to go from 300,000 to even 1 million in 1 year. So my assumption is, I don't remember reading it exactly, but there has to be in the policy an objective of when do we get to those reserves? And in addition, there's the other reserves too, which you've highlighted, which don't need to be fully funded in category 2. Because category 2 is a whole different kettle of fish. Category 3 is another important reserve. Your suggestion is maybe 50%. 50% of the total operating reserve should be investment in cash accounts. I don't know, it's $3 million,
Maybe
In the
2.5 for that one.
but it's already at 3 million, so it's okay?
Oh, you mean the campgrounds?
Yeah, the campground.
Yeah, no, the campgrounds is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's focusing on the stuff that's category 1. That's leviable, that we haven't been adequately levying for because of the impact on our member municipalities.
Yes.
And that puts us in a very difficult position, obviously.
Given that your other sources of revenue for category one have declined or stagnated for 20, 35 years
And then got cut.
and then got cut and user fees have been capped.
Yeah,
So-
but the user fee piece, I mean, we've talked about it. I mean, if the user fee was fully recoverable, how much more money would we be taking in an average year? And I know it goes up and down because it's development related.
Another 500,000 a year?
So it's only $500,000.
Well, I think a little bit more planning and regs.
Okay.
Right now, they're less than 50% cost recovery. If we shifted that policy to align with other CA counterparts that are
Yeah.
recovering about 75%, then there could be additional.
So here's your message back to the minister, which is, here's the case. If you allow us to fully fund our costs, then we commit to use that to build reserves to avoid levy. Because from a financial perspective, our operating reserves for mandatory programs are too damn low. And we want to avoid putting it on the back of our member municipalities. That to me seems to be the easiest way if it was available to us to fund those reserves.
Yeah.
Obviously a big if, so that's plan A. Plan B is a different kettle of fish. And then it's kind of up to us to decide what can our member municipalities live with in order to establish a reserve now so that in the future, we're not asking for more.
So I think the piece of that is that we haven't seen, that we saw it this year, but it was just transfer of reserve from surplus. The problem is, where should that money be transferred to the reserves? And I think that should be part of the policy. The county has a policy where it's okay, this much of the surplus gets transferred percentage wise to these items on aggregate. Obviously, some of that reserve surplus was from capital projects, or does that get transferred right back into? So if a capital project comes in under budget, where's that money go? Does it go back into to capital? So it goes to reserve. So it's not like $700,000 is available to go, that $700,000 surplus cannot go directly to the operating reserves, because there's some that are going to be transferred. Some of that would be capital surplus, some would be operational. And so I think that's where our policy has to speak to what happens with a surplus. So again, we can show our member municipalities that we're using that extra income that was a surplus to try to lower levy in the future and build up our reserves with it in accordance with something that's here's where it goes.
So that's not in this discussion paper or.
Indirectly it is
Yeah.
on the, how to account for reserves, like which reserves do you replenish first? To what extent do you replenish them if you're actually choosing to build a reserve?
But I think what Brian is talking about is establishing policy similar to municipalities so that once you know what your surplus is, something happens to it. So like the City of London has a policy with its surpluses, and it was reported today, like half goes to debt avoidance. And then there's 2 reserve funds that get funded.
Right.
So having that, I'm thinking where you're going with this is if we have that as a policy here. A, it helps our member municipalities and board members knowing, okay, so, oh, wait a minute, you guys got a surplus, you budgeted a deficit, so what are you doing with the surplus? Here's our policy.
Instead of coming to you asking for that money to fund this, now it's going to this. And hopefully if we have multiple years of surplus, that's going to that. That may need levy increases up a little bit up front because we're asking for the operational portion of it. But we need to rebuild those reserves somehow, and it may not be enough.
I'm
Probably it's not gonna be, but
I'm gonna suggest that you're not in a position to rebuild any reserves, and you won't be for some time.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
even with
That
us
has
shipping
to be
sales.
past the $1 million category 1 deficit.
We do need to do that, and that's what I'm talking about. We are gonna have to, the board's gonna have to decide where if they want to go to the municipality for that and what kind of time frame that looks like to close that gap. I know it was put in the budget for next year. And but that may be discussions, okay, what it looks like over 1 to 3 years or something like that to close that gap. We're gonna have to play the long game on this, but at the same time, we do need to, if we do have, we did have a transfer to reserves this year of $700,000 because it was a surplus. So I think we need a policy of saying on a separate thing, yeah, we need to close that gap, but then we need that policy to say, where does this go? When we do transfer, if we have a surplus, does the board think that, yes, that should go to reserves? Or should it go back on the levy, or should it go, where should it go? And then, to me, I would recommend it goes in the reserved accounts, because you're avoiding costs one way or the other. And what we're saying to our member municipalities, we don't have enough reserves. So we're either gonna come to you, or we're gonna use this money, which I guess use this money we already spent, got from you, you're probably gonna say, yeah, that's probably, I would say yes, unless, but it's half of one and dozen of the other, because you gotta go back out and get the cost next year of operations anyway. But I agree 100%, we gotta take care of that deficit, so we can't just we gotta get to a point where we're like we're getting our operations costs, so we're not using reserves to build them. Because right now we're projecting a $1 million deficit, well, we just got 700,000. So now we're at $300,000 deficit. Cause that surplus was not budgeted for this year, right?
In 2024?
Correct.
No, we're projecting a $1.2 million deficit in category 1.
With that surplus,
No, the surplus is last year.
Surplus is last year.
but it still comes in. We have a surplus, we have money that wasn't budgeted for this year, 700,000, we didn't budget.
The 1.2 is just operational
This year,
for this
January,
year,
December,
Nothing to
1.2
do
million
with the-
loss.
left over.
That's it.
That was all, here's a 700,
And it's sitting there.
it's sitting in a reserve. Some sort, it's not an impact on that 1.2. Now.
It's not yet, because there hasn't been, there could be a motion to the board and say, okay, you transfer that money over to operations to use to cover the deficit.
Wait,
But
But effectively you are already.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
approved a $1.2 million deficit. The only way, if that turns out to be actual
Yeah.
deficit,
We're gonna have to use that money.
that 700,000 is gone.
yeah,
So that's the
Last
problem,
year.
is we
And
have,
more.
In the bank until we need it.
we have to get out of approving. It's hard though, because that deficit budget isn't real.
correct.
It's hypothetical at this point until you get to the year end and say, we did get the funding or we didn't get the funding to cover that. That's where it's really tricky to say, but I think if you have a policy that says if you do have a surplus, this is where it goes, is a solid direction in saying, okay, we at least have a direction on how we're gonna fund those reserves with surplus.
But
In that aspect, that's not the only funding model, it can't be.
But because we're year after year doing deficit budgets, we can't really portion off that surplus to any place in case we need it.
You don't know
For the
where,
next
you don't
year.
know where your biggest problem is gonna be a year.
Yeah,
from now.
it's safer. What we're doing right now is just putting it in the pot in case we don't have as good a year as we had last year. As you said,
But that's what they're talking about doing, is building up an actual reserve for that instead of using certain.
Well, yeah, I mean, even though we run cash surpluses, and the surpluses have been going to reserves,
Mhm.
this is what we've got in reserves,
Not a whole lot.
which is
Yeah.
not sufficient.
Taking more out.
And some of it is used from time to time to come into the following year's budget, which on a cash basis is still surplus, but after depreciation is in deficit. So we are mitigating levy increases. But to a certain extent, it's an artificial decrease because we really should keep it in surplus, in reserves.
Yes.
And keep the levy higher.
100%, that to me is step one. We have to raise the levy to a point where we're not reliant on reserves for operational funding. If,
Plan A doesn't work.
if forecasting is correct,
Yeah.
and we come out that we're not relying on that to fund the budget, because we're never gonna get ahead.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's the policy direction to me is that we have a change in our practice where we get the funds needed from the municipality for category 1 funding. And what time frame that overlooks to try to get up to that point is one thing. And then we allocate enough funds. 1, through surplus, 2, through, well, it may be increased levy contributions to get to those needed statements as well. It might not just be to get up to the deficit, it might be increased reserve contributions.
Well, I think one thing that'll help, I don't know if we want to have another discussion at the next Finance and Audit Committee before we go to the board, or we want to go to trial balloon with the board next meeting. Because I'm going to recommend that we have a meeting in May, because I want to hear from our investment advisor in May so that we can report that to the board in June. She's coming in June? Well, that's too bad, because then we won't report to the board until September. Or late August. I guess that's all right. Especially if there's a policy change. Anyway, where I was going was, what might be helpful is if we come up with a number, whatever the number that you really think makes sense for the operating reserve, maybe if we narrow the focus. And just talk about the category 1 operating reserve. And based on what Brian has been floating is, what would be the impact of a policy that would fund to the level you want from levy, if we did it over 5 years, if we did it over 10 years? Is there a way to get a rough idea of what that would add to the annual budget,
The annual levy.
the annual levy?
You want it to stay within 3 digits?
Well, let's
Ideally, it
not
would be
sugar-
like
I don't think
no
we
more
should.
than 10%.
Just
No.
show what it looks like.
No. No.
You've already
we-
done this.
Well, we put a number to the city of London
Yeah.
of 30, I think, for 2025.
30%. Oh, that included funding reserves.
No,
Well, that was without it.
yeah, because
And then they cut us back.
And they kind of spent.
They want, so to me, they're signaling that's over 1 year, right? That's a
Yeah.
1 year hit, so. If they saw us by, maybe it's a 2 year hit or a 3 year hit.
but that's to balance the budget. That's not any addition for the.
Oh, I know,
reserves.
I don't think we're gonna get there overnight, I just don't think we will, this is gonna be a longer term.
And that's kind of where I was trying to go with that idea, was order of magnitude.
Yes,
So if we agree it's a good idea to get the reserve funds in category 1 to a balance that makes us comfortable, and I'm not exactly sure what that number is yet. But it might,
More than 300,000.
it's more than 300,000, maybe less than 3 million. In order to get to there how do you do it if you did a 10% increase a year in levy?
Mhm.
How many years would it take to get to $1.5 million in a reserve?
20.
20 years of 10% increases each and every year.
Because your levy is only funding 40% of your category 1 expenses.
Because we're relying on the other programs to fund the category 1.
We have been,
We have been.
yes, and we're not going to be able to do that from 2024 on.
Well, no, yeah, we're gonna be able to fund category 1 through category 3. Not, well, some of the contracts.
so is this,
If there's a surplus there.
Yeah.
so this is a discussion that we need to have with our members on how they kind of see they want to have this happen. Would they rather have a hit once or a continuous hit over time?
I think we still have to build the case that, well, why do you need the reserves to be as high as being recommended? You've always been able to do this without big reserves, folks. What's the problem?
We don't, like, we're out of reserves.
And now
We
we
don't have the
can't
ability to even do that soon.
take category 3 reserves and move them into category 1.
We can't.
Not for many of our contracts, which is 90%.
So right now, if we end the year with more than a $300,000 budget, just deficit, we're gonna be in trouble. We're going to the bank.
No, we don't need cash. We don't have a cash issue. You're gonna be running a deficit. You're gonna have negative reserves. What you're not also saying is that this 6 million on this sheet, the audited financial statements had 9.
Okay.
But there's a -3 out there already. That's why I only presented you with 6.
Talk to
That's
me,
real.
talk to me about the investments, because we have $15 million in investments. I'm showing $6 million in reserves, which are part of those investments.
And
Unpopular opinion, do we take, is there an option to take money out of those to fund these reserves?
you've got 9 million in deferred revenue on your balance sheet already. We've received $9 million from various sources to use for a purpose. And yes, we bought some assets and we haven't done some programs, but we're gonna be using that 9 million for the next 20, 30 years.
So that's an important piece to
We have to fund that.
to show that on there, because that's gonna be hey, you've got $15 million in the bank, use that. But we need to be able to show why we can't use that. So we're showing that we do have $6 million in available funds in operative reserves. Sorry, that's the total. Yeah, total. And a lot of those, like you say, are campground. Half of those are campgrounds, which they're gonna say, okay, well, I don't care about the campgrounds, use them for your operations, and we can't because they're category 3.
Well, you can't because they were never levy funded.
Well,
And-
they're self-generated funds.
But they're
That's
also,
what the government wanted us to do more of.
but they're also spending 2.5 million in 2024 for capital refurbishment.
Okay, so that's already planned. So I'm just trying to go through that, because
Yeah.
you're gonna get these questions of people coming out. So how do we form a policy that takes these all into account? I think, the policy is that we are gonna have to increase, step one is that we increase levy contributions to offset more of the budget. Through whatever time frame or mechanism that, the board and municipalities can kind of come. I think they need a part of that conversation. Some people might say, well, just hit me. I'd rather get it over with. What's my contribution to this thing? Do you do a special levy of just one-time funding for reserves, or do you span it out over a time? 2, I think that, to me, there has to be a policy there of where, surpluses and how they get attributed to reserves and then they be used for reserves. And then operational savings. So what if we can increase any operational savings that we gain from user fees, offsets and stuff like that, need to be recognized that maybe not be a savings to the municipalities till we get up to these certain points, that be used directly towards funding reserves. Because we're gonna have to scrimp and it's savings. You gotta scrimp and save anywhere you can. And then we can say, I think that would get the municipalities on board even more. To show that, okay, we're gonna not only try to get that, we need the fee freeze to stop, but we need to allocate a much stronger possibility. And I would ask them to sign resolutions, as other councils have done, directing the conservation authority to have full cost recovery. Durham region's done that. Now they're all under one, but that was the thing that was brought up at the meeting, was that they have a resolution from Durham Council stating that they should have full cost recovery where possible. Now they can't follow that own resolution because the province has put a freeze on it. So if we can get support from, okay, if you give us this, we'll use that money to get to this. And then if we get these funded, when we get those funded, even though it may never happen, you'll get a break. Because we just want to maintain a certain level in these reserves to make them operationally, but you can't have a savings yet because this will put you in a better position for the future. We're not coming to you for. I think, what else can we do? We still may have to go to them and say, okay, in the meantime, we need operational reserves because of the rules and changes in category 3. We can't, in category 1, 2, and 3, we can't use this over here for that. So we're in a dire situation. We need to, number one, when we make that levy increase, it's got to go to this fund. I guess that's something for the board. What's the most important? And I'm hearing from staff, it's probably operational, because it's,
January 1.
it happens every time, every year. Is that something that? Am I kind of? What's people's thoughts on that?
Well, by the end of the year, we're gonna have a full inventory of our land. And probably at some point, we're gonna have a discussion of selling some land, especially the Glengowan stuff that was purchased for a project that's never gonna happen. And I think a lot of people would say, well, if you're short of cash, why don't you do what anybody else would do and sell some of your assets? But would we be able to take, say we sold 500 acres, would we be able to take that money and put it into operating reserves, or that's,
Are there restrictions?
another way of-
Is that?
are
is
there
that
restrictions
clear?
of where that money has to go if we were to sell assets?
The direction in under the act is that the minister may direct us to where those funds should be. I would
Okay.
hope that through our land strategy with the acquisition and disposition policies, we have a path that we would like to follow
Right.
for either setting up a specified reserve for future land acquisitions. But perhaps again, using the investments as an
Portion of it.
opportunity to then any interest earned on those investments be put back into the operating.
And I,
That we're demonstrating to the minister that, yeah, we're not, Dean, you were mentioning it like sell the cow. So you don't have the milk.
Sell the cow to pay for the mortgage.
Yeah, exactly.
well,
But we have some funds for.
That's happened before.
and I think that's, there may be middle ground there, because as much as I want to acquire more land, if we don't have financial,
Mhm.
we may have to say, okay, until we get to this level, it may be a two-stage thing. The reserves have to be funded first to this level, and then it goes to the fun stuff. But I think that's probably a part of it as well.
There has to be something in the back, and I agree with acquiring more land if it's hazardous land and whatnot. Do we need to own, I don't know how, we got what, probably 1,000 acres or more? I can't remember a couple of years ago when we did the bidding, how many acres, but that was significant.
Yeah.
Do we need to own farmland? Is another discussion, I think, at the board.
Well, I think staff, the staff will bring forward and recommend. what we
Yeah,
can.
once we've got that inventory and everything, there'll be recommendations, but that's if we can, if the government will let us at least use a portion of that, that needs to be rather than yeah, ideally, we can raise fees to 75% or 100%. The government, that's gonna be a fight with the government.
Yeah,
The other thing is raised levy, but the third leg on the stool is divesting of some assets to raise cash, because that's what businesses.
yeah, and that's fair. I mean, I agree with you that somewhere along the line, either it's recommended by us or by CO that input from the relevant conservation authority be allowed, because one size may not fit all. But it still doesn't help in the 2025 budgeting.
Yeah.
Because we won't have an answer.
No, that is more of
Yeah,
a 5-year.
oh, yeah, for sure, yeah.
Maybe longer.
And then there's two parts of that too, because selling stuff, so there's one-time funding that can go to reserves, and there's ongoing funding. And it's the ongoing. To me, we will have land that we can sell, but that's, once you sell it, you only get one shot at it. So it's that sustainable ongoing funding. It may get us help to get to a point where we need to be, but how do we not fall back into that same habit that we had before?
Yeah, I agree.
It's like, oh, there's money there, well, this year, only this year, and then only next year, and then the year after. Because everybody around the table is going, it's a tough budget year. I haven't heard a good budget year yet.
It's like the building industry, there's never been a good year.
No. 200 years of bad.
Yeah, that's amazing. Anyway, yeah, no, you're right. Nobody feels that they pay too much in tax.
No,
The other way around.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's, yeah.
I'd rather pay.
Shut up.
But that's where if we can enshrine it more in this
Yeah.
is something I tell all boards and committees, but don't have to be there to make the decision every year where it goes. We need to shrine it in policy, so it just, staff can just make it happen.
We haven't had a budgeting approach documented. We don't have any guidance on what happens to surpluses at the end of the year. It's kind of our choice. It's not been good.
Which, to be honest, is, I don't know, it's dangerous, not dangerous, it's because we have good staff, but it's not prudent oversight from the
No,
board.
Exactly. So, and this is, we have to restructure our reserves this year. And if this is the picture of what it's gonna look like, then I want everybody to know this, even if we don't have a policy in place, but we really should be getting a policy in place on how we approach budgeting. Should category 1 be balanced? Are we really worried about category 3 being balanced when we set a budget? Maybe, maybe not, because we can effectively cut expenses in category 3 if we don't have the revenue. So that's okay. Campgrounds are always going to budget for a surplus because they've been able to. So
There should be a
that's
money making
great. So
operation.
really, it's really category 1. Where our deficit is coming from is in category 1. And it's either on the revenue side or the expense side. And when I look at the levy being 40% and a lot of other CAs are 75 and 80, there's an issue there. But I also know that member municipalities had a 45% increase this year in levy.
No.
And they can't do that. Like, they just can't afford that.
That's what I was referring to.
Exactly.
earlier. You just can't keep doing
No,
it.
they can't.
And I'm gonna bring that asset management plan back in again. Outline where do we see the money having to go
Mhm.
and when? What timeline? And then tie that back to any allocation decisions that should be, well, ought to have been made before. Or what's the plan? Like, where do we see the money having to go? Okay, every year when we have surplus, where should it be dispersed?
And what I'm gonna point out is, yeah, we did do that this year, but why? Why did we do that? Because every year, for a lot of years prior to that, it wasn't where the increase needed to be.
Yeah.
So we were, and I see this all over, and you're seeing it. I'm gonna argue the city of London did it this year. They suppressed what the budget needed to be this year to get a number. And guess what? They're gonna do the exact same thing, if not more, next year, because you can see it in the documents, it just goes up the next year. We've had a lot of pressure around the table to keep our budgets low, but the cost of, and so, yeah, all of a sudden, it gets to a point, mostly through legislation, where it's just like, you can't, there's no sustainability there whatsoever. There may be a couple of tough years, like, we're not even close to not having tough years, it's probably not, maybe not 45%, but it's not gonna be, the message shouldn't be, oh, don't expect a 2 or 3% increase coming, it's not. Because we gotta fix these historical issues. I do think the land sales is gonna be a piece of it,
Not for 2025.
not for 2025 though. But that's where we have to think about the time frame of, okay, this is not a 1-year fix. It can't be, we can't hit that, it's just not gonna happen.
So I'm thinking, what are we gonna report to the board?
I don't think we're there yet.
No, well, I don't know if we want to have some discussion with the board before we get somewhere, because let me break this down for a minute. 2025, I think you, Christine, you're looking for some direction what to do with 2025.
We will need some direction, the
Yeah.
sooner the better.
Right, and for next year, and then you'll need some policy direction for 2026 and beyond. 2026 and beyond is almost easier in my mind based on our discussion, because we talked about, well, there's the land piece. That we maybe can start through CO having some discussions about what the minister will allow to happen. B, some levy discussions with our member municipalities, obviously. And also, ammunition to go back to the minister about the fee cap, the fee freeze. So those are a little easier to come up with some policy stuff around that. If the fee freeze comes off, it all goes to reserves, for argument's sake, in category one. But 2025 is the dilemma now, because none of those are gonna be available, in my mind. We'll be very lucky if they take the cap off the freezes during this year in time for 2025 budget. So for 2025 budgeting, we've already got a problem. I don't know how we can go to the member municipalities and say, we're gonna start funding our reserves in 2025 with a special levy or whatever you want to call it. So that almost buys us a little bit of time to come up with policies, come up with, you know, and I'm thinking, let's make this easy. Let's just focus on category one operating. You know, start with that. And say, here's where we think we need to go. Here's how we might be able to do it. Here's the shopping list. And it's not all or nothing in one of those pieces. It may be, you know, part from levy, part from land, part from that. I don't know. But let's start trying to draft a policy. And then maybe, I don't know how you guys feel about, at what point do we present it to the board for discussion?
I think we don't present it to the board until we around the table feel comfortable defending it to the board and have understanding. And I don't think we're at that level yet.
Yeah.
Two things, I also don't want to lose the fact that, yeah, we have $3 million in reserves for category 3, but we don't, the full capital requirements. There needs to be a policy around contribution to that, because what are the capital requirements for campgrounds? And that relates to fee structures and stuff like that, to have a plan. You're gonna have an asset management plan, or the problem with asset management, it only identifies stuff that's there right now. And there's changes that need to be made. How much money is actually needed to go towards capital? Because $3 million seems like a lot, but if you're spending 2.5 this year, it could be, what's the plan? Is it 2.5 million for the next 5 years?
No, it can't be, because.
Oh, no, it can't be, but what are the needs? What are the needs?
Your recommendation is 2.1 million. In this, in your,
Yeah.
yeah.
For operations,
Oh,
not for capital.
Not for capital.
No.
So that's, so operational reserves for campgrounds is 3 million they have right now,
Yes,
Yeah.
total.
but where's the capital structure? There's nothing.
At campgrounds?
Yeah.
No, that's gonna come out of the 3 million.
So it's combined. Operation and
Yeah.
capital is
Yeah. Yeah.
it's combined in operational reserve for category 3.
You can come out of reserve to go either direction, right?
That's the
Where
same
it
with,
needs to be.
that's the same with the structure reserves. They're for operations and capital.
I wonder if that could be separated for. Yeah, I'm worried about, I know we're not gonna, like, you just look at the work and stuff that needs to be done. There's a lot of need there. Second of all, we have mayors, I hate to do this, but we need to get a 2025 budget through. We need London +1. So you need London at the table. What does it look like? He's saying he's gonna cut 50%
That was of our ask, of our total ask.
of our total ask. Where does that put us in relation to?
Another $1 million deficit. In 2025.
So if he cuts it by 50%, all that other 50% was the stuff that was going down.
So if we reduce the levy ask at what we think has to be for 2025, if we reduce that by half, you're gonna have another 1.2 million deficit.
Because it goes down for all the other member municipalities.
It's not just London's that goes.
Yeah.
No, I'm trying to get to the point
But
where,
it's $1.2 million in addition to the
In
current.
addition to this
deficit.
year.
because you're talking to, like, you're talking, what do we do for 2025? And I agree.
Yeah,
How do we get London on board to enough where we start moving in that direction of increased funding towards to limit that deficit in category 1? And what does that number, what percentage is that?
well, Brian, I think one of the things is I'm not 100% sure the mayor did that without just picking a number out of the air.
Oh, I know we did, but we still gotta negotiate.
No, I agree. But part of that discussion is, here's our reserve issue. Okay? Here's what you're asking for 2025, which is to add $1.2 million to our deficit budget, which will put us in a negative cash position, which will draw reserves down even further. Well, frankly, we can't even make that up
No,
with our category one reserve right now,
Yeah.
which is $300,000. We need to be able to communicate that to the mayor
Yes.
now, before it gets to the time where Christine is talking to the finance people about the budget, because the finance people are just gonna say, sorry, you can only ask for 50% of what you asked for last year, because this is what's in the city budget. So the discussion has to be at the mayor level.
And tie it to his 47,000 home goal.
So we need to have, we need,
Seriously.
so we need to, we need
That's your leverage.
100%, we need to set up a meeting with the mayor
Mhm.
and go hat in hand and go, look at this. He's gonna understand. I don't, he'll know the number. Like, I'm not worried about that.
Keep Lewis out of the room.
But say, look at this, this is the situation, and regardless, we were working on a plan to rectify this. You know, it used to be, we could use these reserves over here. We can't, so this is what we're left with this year. So I think you would realize that that's not acceptable. Let's start these discussions about how we get out of this
Mhm.
and what you're comfortable with. So when we ask for that, it's not a surprise.
Right.
Keeping in mind, we're gonna be working with you. But we can't do this.
And we talk about, well, in the future, we should be able to, we hope to, based on land levy and blah, 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 or fees.
yeah,
But for 2025, here's the reality.
squeezed.
And so at least give him some hope that later on we can deal with it.
But I think that's fair. I think we've probably, as a board, have failed in that aspect of having those discussions about the future of every year. And that's why we get this thing pushed back at the end of the year when we pass a budget going, oh, it's too tough a year because people weren't prepared for it early enough. And we weren't prepared for it early enough because we didn't understand the scenario of where those reserves are. But when it comes to forming policy, what do we have to do to try to get to the next level for better understanding?
With our board or with,
Well, how do we move forward? Like, how do we get to, what's the next step to get to something that's on paper?
Which presumably is your draft 2025 budget. Because that's going to give you the information that you need to
Well-
go talk to people
Well, I'm thinking, well, we gotta have those discussions
soon.
prior, yeah, because we know, so we'll need some information about numbers and percentages based off different scenarios, which I'm sure you can provide. But to go to the board, we're gonna need, to me, I think we should be going to the board with. We're having enough trouble understanding this. I think we're gonna have to go to the board with a pretty much, hey, what do you think about this?
okay, yeah,
If we go any earlier, you're gonna get confusion.
ABC plan.
I think
Or
so, and
at
then,
least an A plan,
something we're comfortable with.
and it could be short, medium, long term,
yeah,
Yeah.
explaining that out.
Yeah.
Because you're gonna get the same questions, but okay, here's the longer term plan. We explore the look of land sales. There's more, like you said, the more you get, more options out there, but this is the problem, and I think the board does need to know about this problem.
no,
It's like, here's writing on the wall, there's 315,000 in the bank. If we can't come up with 700,000 plus this year to that deficit, we're in a bad position. It doesn't get any better next year unless we raise more money to go to that.
When's your initial sit down with city finance folks?
Normally it's July. So I think we're targeting June to get our 2025 and 2026 budget.
So you'll have it
laid
for,
out.
we do this at June meeting?
Yeah, I would think so. I think we have to do that. Have something firm for June's meeting.
And then we can go to the mayor with
Talking
that.
our budget,
Well, yeah,
and if
exactly.
we don't have
Yeah,
this out of the way before we talk our budget,
sure.
then we're just treading.
Right, yeah.
Dog paddling.
So we need, I'm suggesting we meet again in May, whether it's after the board meeting or some other time. No, can't.
I agree.
So I think we
Maybe some
need a
other
separate board, a meeting of this committee. And so if you can, Michelle, send around some dates and stuff that work with staff, and
And it can be Zoom or whatever.
it can be Zoom for them, but I think in person helps.
It does, but no, if someone can't.
If they can't, they can't.
No, sorry, in May.
Yeah. Ideally, well, it doesn't matter if it's before or after the board, but the issue being trying to get some sort of draft policy in two steps, the 2025 and then 2026 and beyond. Have you heard enough, Christine, that you could draft something out of the mess that we've left you?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand that these are big topics.
Yeah.
And I know we're not gonna get to the end of these to turn this into a policy because it's too large and too encompassing at this point. But we could put something on paper that hopefully that can say, this is the approach we're taking to category 1 programs in terms of ensuring that they're adequately funded. And here's some choices of approaches or parts of approaches, and then we can choose some. Because there are limited resources for category 1 programs. There's
Yeah.
governments, there's some user fees. Nobody else funds category 1 stuff. It's public sector, lands, property, planning and development. That's the work of category 1. And if the province isn't funding us directly, which they're not, if they're not giving us adequate limits, which they're not, where does the funding come from? And that's the problem that we've been facing and are going to continue to face.
In that meeting, we're gonna have to, if you can summarize, or the board, the members will have to summarize key messaging on this about the points that we've discussed today, for one, notes, but about, okay, here's this issue. You know, there's some key messages there that short, medium, long term as well, that we're gonna have to say to our partners,
Mhm.
especially the mayors, and you know, I'll be honest, like Oxford County is not gonna care the same as London. Because the engagement is not, I've tried to engage county councilors and stuff like that, they don't have the engagement. Paul and Mark do, like as board members, but
Yeah.
as a corporate body, they don't see Oxford County as, they don't see UTRCA as like the same funding threat level as, there's a, it's not the same cultural viewpoint of it.
Okay.
Now, it just looks the same as like, St. Mary's and Perth have a different cultural viewpoint. They're much more, so I don't think it's the London, and I don't want to ignore the Perth South and stuff viewpoint, but we're facing, you know, unfortunately, they got 50% of the vote.
Right.
And so if we don't get them on board, there's no even getting anybody else on board.
North, South and St. Mary's are gonna vote against whatever we do anyway,
Yeah.
unless we got me.
Well, and I'm concerned about the
Give
board.
them money.
I am concerned about the board in general. It's gonna be an education process enough to get them comfortable. This is a big change. And it's gonna require that forward thinking to go, okay, like. Bill, it's gotta be ingrained enough in policy for someone to say yes, to make sure it happens in the future. Because you can't rely on future boards to put their hand like, okay, we'll make this decision every year. And once it's ingrained, then it's gonna be hard for people. It'd be hard for a Perth South to change policy.
So if you need some back and forth with members of this committee, feel free, and maybe because Hart wasn't part of the discussion, I hate to say it, but, you know, he should be included, but at the same time, it's tough. He's gonna look at this and go, where the heck did this come from? But he is part of the committee, so.
Well, this part of the discussion is open session, so he can view.
Okay.
Okay, well, that's good.
I'll
Okay,
encourage him.
so encourage him to do so. You know, and like I said, Christine, if you require some back and forth from the committee between now and the next meeting on, well, please do. I guess we've beaten this to death for this stage. That's my feeling. I don't know how you guys feel.
Yeah.
There's a lot to take in.
Just had one more point to add, and then going back to our meetings
Yeah,
that Sandy and I had with the city back up in March.
yeah,
Where is it here? Mayor Morgan stated in his opinion, the designation of the 3 service level categories equated to what he called the transparency mess. The quote unquote transparency mess. He wants to know what specific things that London is paying for in each of these levels. His exact words were, what are we getting? So
right.
when we come back to him and say we need more money, he will want to know where's it going and
Well, that's fair.
why it's important. When you're having the talk, that will be in his mind because he's mentioned it before.
Yeah. And that,
Sorry, Dean, when you say the levels, do you mean the categories?
He's fuzzy, he's fuzzy.
He's fuzzy on
what
yeah,
What
He
that
doesn't pay-
represents.
yeah, he doesn't pay for 3. He
No,
pays for
he's still-
2 on basically user pay. Category 2 rather. And category 1 is, I suggested this to Tracy and you ran out of time to do it. For each of the member municipalities, what is in category 1? And how much is it? Would be really helpful, and maybe for this exercise,
Yeah.
just focus on London for now.
Yeah.
Because then it'll be relatively easy to break it out for everybody else.
I gotta say that,
Because they don't know. You're right, dude.
I don't
They
know.
don't know. Why would they?
It's a mystery to them and
Yeah.
they just hear increase and then
Yeah,
they get scared about it. But if we show that their objective is, what was it, 47,000 units or?
yeah,
Then we're part of that. So the authority is part of helping them realize that goal. So to reach that goal, they need to help us so that we can help them to realize the
yeah,
goal.
because most of the publicity that we do is related to category 3. You know, the work that Emily does to put out each month, the current, it's primarily category 3. So people might get the impression that we're paying for that, and might wonder why. Or politicians, I mean.
I think one of the key messages that we gotta remember as well is that we had these reserves, like the category splitting up of these reserves is something that's new. And so we had more options before.
Definitely have more
We
options.
had more options and now we don't. And so I don't want it to be like, okay, well, these things weren't being managed prudently. The rules have changed. We had access to more, not that we should have, but we had more access. Okay, if you could pull funds over here and then put them back later, you can't do that anymore. So now it's limited the ability, and that can be feedback to the province as well, is that like, you've really tied our hands and changed the way we operate. And that was a big one. And it put us in a real pickle here as far as, it's good to notice this stuff, but at the same time, it's like that big change of, we had a pot of money before we could use it. Now we have a little pot of money. So we're gonna have to change the way those policies are, but I think working on this is a good thing.
The pot is the same. It's just you only access to certain parts of smaller parts of the pot.
To be really blunt, it's only been scarcely a year that we've been able to see what our category 1 programs cost.
Yes.
Because we've never been challenged to group our work because it's been so integrated.
Yep.
And now the need to separate our programs in category 1, 2, and 3, and the ability to levy only now for category 1 means that one, we're gonna be challenged to fund category 3 programs in a way we never were before. That is gonna take a lot of effort.
Yep.
And category 1, if the province wants dams to continue to operate, has to be funded, and it's not,
And it can't be borne by the levy solely.
So,
obviously.
so that's,
But to the municipal members.
that's one more thing right
No, the
there.
province needs to hear that.
Well, and that's what our municipal partners need to hear too. If you don't want to bear this cost, you need to join in and be like, you better get the province on board, you know, to fund some of these needs because, and provide that funding,
Mhm.
because we need it from, that's a category 1. The province has a share in
That's
it.
category 1.
That's category 1 there, and we need to be able to pay for it. And so the other ones, the province said this is what category 1 is. We didn't do that, but we need to operate those. And so right now they're saying, go get it from you for
Mhm.
user fees. How do you feel about that? And oh wait, user fees are capped, by the way, so.
There will be municipalities, and mine is one of them, where we pay the levy, but then we have to pay for our structures. So it's the double indemnity, paying the operating levy plus the structures levy. Like we get connecting link funding and we get gas tax money, all this other infrastructure. But why aren't we getting the prevention funding for this infrastructure too?
Sometimes you do it through WECI.
WECI hasn't
Just the
changed.
repair.
That's
Capital,
theirs,
capital repairs only, and
not operating.
not a cent of operating. We get $181,215 for operating.
Yes.
$5 million for the whole province.
5 million for the whole province, and that number hasn't changed in
Teal spends over
15,
$1
20
billion.
years.
So-
Hasn't increased in a long time.
And that's the message I think it adds on is like, okay, the province needs to, you know, I would hope that Mayor Morgan and the rest of the mayors, you know, they seem open to like the fees because they recognize the levy. It's not just that, it's, you know, these dam structures reach farther down south than just London. That one particularly, it has more benefits. But the funding model stops at Delaware. The province needs to pick up. Like you say, they give gas tax and stuff for infrastructure, but
Just be consistent with the rest of the programming here.
Okay.
It's not that, well, it shouldn't be that hard.
So,
Just say
Michelle,
yeah.
do you need a motion of some sort that we ask staff to come back, to a meeting in May with further refinements to the discussion that we held today?
Chair, you can call me.
Yeah,
Then-
well, yeah, I just did, yeah. So is that motion something you needed for the minute?
I can, I think I've already got just direction to staff to set up a meeting
Yeah,
in May.
Further discussion. Okay.
for further discussion on policy related to reserves for 2025 and 2026 and beyond. So can I get somebody to move that for one? Moved by Dean, seconded by Brian. Any discussion? All in favor? Carried. Motion to adjourn? Moved by Brian. Thank you. Good meeting, long day. Thank you, everybody. Important topics.
Not as long as yesterday.
So,